Hello there, I'm Bob Plankers. I'm a staff technical marketing architect at VMware Corporation, and I talk a lot about security and compliance with cloud infrastructure. When I talk about cloud infrastructure, I really mean VMware Cloud, vSphere, vSAN, VMware Cloud Foundation, that sort of thing. And so you may have seen my stuff. I'm happy to have been invited to talk with you folks today. And mostly just greetings from halfway around the world. I'm in the center of the U.S., the northern center of the U.S., a place called Wisconsin. And so, always like talking to folks from around the world. And so, let's talk about designing cloud infrastructure for resilience and security. Resilience, really the idea that we can survive outages, big ones, small ones. Security events are small outages sometimes. Sometimes they're big outages. Ransomware is pretty scary in that regard. And so we don't have a ton of time. We've got 30 minutes, I believe. And so let's get moving. I've got quite a number of slides here. So first up, I always talk about my disclaimer. I'm probably the only person at VMware that talks about the disclaimer, and it's a good opportunity to remind everyone that security involves context. It's really important to have context for what you're doing with security. There's some things that I do that are probably not good ideas for your organization. There's some things that your organization should do or does that may not fit with the way I need to operate, and that's all right. Security is also always a trade-off. Turning on all the security often costs you performance, it costs you money, it costs you time and staff time, will to live sometimes. It makes life hard in a lot of cases. And so being thoughtful about that, and that's, there's some legalese to remind us that these are educational, these are suggestions, and your organization probably is different. I also threw in a slide. This is a marketing slide. I do have marketing in my title, and it's all right. But I'm going to skip the other numbers, wherever they came from. Ransomware, big, scary, nasty. We've got a lot of stuff in an environment. I'm really interested in, here, does this work? Oh, yes, this does work. And 341 days, the average number of days to detect and contain a breach. That's really crazy high, like 341 days. That's the average. That's the mean. So we're saying that, that's nuts. That's a long time for an attacker to be inside your systems. And so, what do we do about it? Well, to do something about it, we need to know a little bit about our attackers. And I always like putting this up here. This is what a lot of organizations think the attackers are, the hackers out there. The person in a hoodie, probably a guy, stereotypically a guy. A lot of blue light here. Blue light's not good for sleeping, so they probably are up all times of the day. Looks smoky in that room. I hope nothing's on fire. Actually, why do I care? This is a criminal, right? They're attacking us. But my point is, joking aside, my point is that this is actually just sort of the movie version of who we think our attackers are. The real version of our attackers is this. They look like businesses. They act like businesses. They have holiday parties. They go to work at 9 in the morning and go home at 5 p.m. They have bosses. They fight with their copiers. They, have fire drills and performance reviews and OKRs and all that stuff. And their job, what do they have on their performance reviews? How much money did you steal? What did you steal this week? And it's big business for a lot of organizations that work on this stuff and that conduct ransomware attacks and things. And so these are our attackers. They're organized, they're clever, and they're not to be underestimated. Though there's a lot of less skilled ones out there. Those are not the less skilled attackers are not necessarily the ones we're worried about. We're worried about the ones that are skilled, that know as much as we do about these systems and the software and all that stuff. And so let's talk about, in order to understand our enemy more, in order to become resilient to attacks, let's talk about how these attacks come about happening. What are the main ways that organizations are attacked? Compromised credentials, absolutely the number one way in through Active Directory. Somebody gets a phishing and social engineering sort of thing going on. The number two way in, humans get email links in email, URLs in email, incredibly dangerous. and we'll click on stuff. Admins click on stuff. We saw in the news recently, large transport company in the U.S. That where an admin did something that he wasn't supposed to and let the attackers in. Yeah, it happens, and so then they had the compromised credentials. They could had access to Active Directory. From their Active Directory, they just let themselves into everything else. They had domain admin in that. Insider threats are scary. Like somebody decides in your organization that they want to do harm to the organization. How do you catch that? I'm not going to talk about that at length. We don't have a lot of time to talk about that, but I've got some resources. Configuration mistakes. Clearly, we just shouldn't make configuration mistakes, right? There's some strategies for that. Standardization is the big strategy there. So at least if it's wrong, it's wrong everywhere. There's scanning and things that you can do, and then software vulnerabilities. The good old-fashioned software vulnerabilities. Not that VMware ever has software vulnerabilities, but if something's in my throat there. But if we did, and we do, obviously. I'm joking, but all software has vulnerabilities, and so being able to patch that is really important. So what we really want to do is go from this model. This is old school IT. Actually, this is an English castle. This is Bodiam Castle, and this is old school IT, where there's a known entry point, a big, a walkway. There's a moat. There's these big walls. But once you're inside, you can kind of do whatever you want, right? This is a normal organization for most people. Or for most organizations, this is normal. This is, once somebody's inside, desktops can do whatever they want. It's all good, right? We need to really fix that. And so what we need is this, not to call something a prison, but this is the former U.S. prison, Alcatraz, very famous. It's out in the San Francisco Bay and not far from VMware headquarters. And it is like a castle in many regards. It's got thick walls. It's got a moat around it. The San Francisco Bay has got nasty tides, and it's very cold and has sharks in it and all kinds of stuff. But what it also has, and what we need, and my whole point is, not to call our IT infrastructures prisons, but we want the internal controls. It's got the internal controls so that if somebody is somewhere they're not supposed to be, they get detected. They get, and that's what takes that 341 days and turns it into 2 days, 1 day. That's what we really need to do, and that's the basis of zero trust. We talk a lot about zero trust in the industry, and that's the basis of the zero trust stuff. So, when it comes to resilience, though, there's a few questions that I like to ask. What happens when, it's all turned off? From a resilience perspective and a disaster recovery and a business continuity perspective, thinking about these sorts of questions, really important. Is it all turned off? One of my favorite questions of all time. Dependencies. Map out your dependencies. Take a look at them. I didn't do that once. I learned the hard way that somebody had put my authoritative DNS name server inside of my infrastructure, which I needed that in order to boot my infrastructure. Very uncool. You don't want to find that out in the middle of an outage like I did once. Most of my lessons here I've lived through the hard way. I'll just tell you that. And so I'm hoping to give you ideas to save yourself some pain. But, keeping good control of your dependencies, and we'll talk about that in just a few minutes here. How do you figure that out beforehand? What happens when it needs to be updated? Things need to be patched, and patching is just a scheduled outage, right? If your services aren't resilient, they can't ever be patched. If your services aren't resilient, though, what happens if there's a real outage? You're going to be down. And so attending to this, how do you fix that? And then what happens if your workloads just can't run where they're at right now, because of a natural disaster, because of ransomware, other situations, where are you going to run them? You run them in the VMware Cloud. VCDR stuff is really great for that. But do you have a plan? Is your plan written down? Is your plan written down in a way that you can get to if everything is down because of ransomware, for example? That's another big thing, And so it's really important to think about that stuff ahead of time. So let's get into those 5 ways. First, compromised credentials. What do we do about that? Well, let's talk about authentication for just a second. There's local authentication. The way I see it, there's basically 3 ways to authenticate. There's local authentication, which I've got a whole slide full of words. It's my least favorite slide ever, but I'll get to it in a second here. Local authentication, centralized authentication, and dedicated authentication. And I try not to have this many words, but people like to take a screenshot of this, and so I just wrote it all down. Local authentication, great isolation. Somebody breaks into your corporate Active Directory instance, who cares? We do our own authentication, but there's making sure that everyone's got secure passwords, monitoring all that stuff, setting password policies. Most infrastructure isn't really good about multi-factor authentication, just to be honest about it. And security's hard enough as it is without me not being honest about things. I'm just going to be honest. Most infrastructure doesn't do authentication well because it's not its strength. It turns it over to something else. But that something else is like a corporate Active Directory, and that's great, but everything's got access to that, and it, one of the things I want to talk about with that, and central Active Directories are nice because they're easier to monitor, it's all in one place, that sort of thing. But when everyone's got access to it, and, it's under attack, and it really changes the tone of security advisories too. CVSS scores and severities. You'll see a vulnerability announcement or a disclosure from VMware that says that something is maybe an important one, but it's not critical. Often the difference there is authentication. If it's serious, but the authentication the attacker needs to authenticate in order to get into the environment to exploit the problem, right? And so that's what makes it an important one. If they didn't need authentication, it would be critical. But if an attacker has control of a desktop, if they've got control of a user account and perhaps domain admin or whatever, they can authenticate. And, and so that changes that vulnerability from important to critical for an organization. And there's a lot of organizations that are starting to assume that they've got a desktop that's hacked, that they've got a user account that is being controlled by somebody malicious. And that's a really powerful thing. It's kind of grim, but it's a really powerful change in attitude because that means that they make different decisions and they take different actions. Then what I call dedicated authentication. It's kind of like centralized authentication, except it's only for infrastructure. A lot of organizations looking at this right now and doing this, really segregating their authentication behind authentication for infrastructure is different. It's behind the firewalls. They're putting very strong perimeter guards around the infrastructure management, putting their authentication for infrastructure behind it, connect via VPN and things like that, but really protect it differently than the normal corporate stuff, and that's a really important thing. Couple of points with authentication. Audit successes. When you're monitoring for this stuff, don't just look for failures. People who have stolen credentials aren't going to generate failures. It's going to be a successful login, and that's why it takes 341 days to catch these folks. Is because you're not looking for the clues. You're not looking for the right clues that they're in there. And so audit successes as well. One easy thing you can do, and you can do right now, well, maybe after I'm done talking here, but in a few minutes, we've got about 15 minutes to go, just stop using Active Directory groups. Honestly, if your domain admin wants to log into vSphere, all the domain admin has to do is drop themselves into the vSphere admins group, and then they can do whatever they want. Somebody who's hacked Active Directory can do the same thing. Instead, burst it out into user accounts. You see, I'm using a different user account than my login to my desktop. Admins do dumb things too. And so if somebody compromises plankers on my desktop, I want them to generate failures trying to log into my infrastructure systems. Little clues that help us figure out that there's a problem, that sort of thing. But here, by splitting it out and not using the group, an attacker has to figure out what account they need, and then they've got to do something like change my password in order to be able to break into it. And that's going to be a big clue. The next time I try to log in, I'm going to, why can't I log in? We're going to look in the logs and we're going to go, oh no, this is not good, But again, clues, leaving yourself clues. Phishing and social engineering, not going to say too much about this. Humans are just going to be humans, and we need to just accept it and defend ourselves against it, and it is what it is. But I will say that vCenter server is for vSphere admins. Just your organization probably doesn't let just anybody walk around in your data center, right? You need to be a sysadmin or somebody that belongs there. Well, why do organizations let everyone log into vSphere? It's a virtual data center. Don't do that. Bad idea. And so and have workload admins RDP in or SSH in. At the very least, it makes the firewall rules a lot easier, but it also limits the scope of vCenter Server. And everybody that can log into vCenter Server is an attack vector. Just that's the reality of it. And so if you shrink that down, you've got less attack vectors. Simple math. A lot of organizations can't do that. It's a hard conversation to have. There's a firewall on the VCSA that you can do a little bit of auditing and just make sure you can say, oh well, we tightened up the firewall rules and only admins can get in. Oh, sorry, we must have not realized that you're an admin, that sort of thing. But not that I'm encouraging you to be insubordinate or go against your organization or anything. But you can be a little creative. Devious, I think. But anyhow, just make sure you add an allow rule before you add the deny all IP addresses thing. Otherwise, you're going to lock everybody out, that sort of thing. But use your head. Use a test environment. Nested test environments are great. Insider threats. Not going to talk too much about that, but I do want to say insider threats. What helps immensely is separation of duties. This is a security concept that, well, frankly, the idea that more than one person should be involved in completing a task. Banks do this all the time where, you've got to get multiple people involved. Sometimes it's the two key sort of thing, like you watch movies like Hunt for Red October. I like that movie. I just watched it recently. The two key thing for the nuclear missiles and all that stuff. Separation of duties. You need more than one person because it's harder to corrupt more than one person. But, even just separating who manages the firewall, who manages the storage, who manages the backup systems, who manages the system, the workloads, that helps a lot because more eyeballs mean less chances for fraud. The U.S. government, and I don't know about other world governments, and I apologize, but I do know the U.S. government, for whatever, better or worse, but the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, what we call CISA, has a great page on this stuff. And so I often point people all around the world at this page. It's not specific to the U.S., but just is U.S. funded by the U.S. government, that sort of thing. But they've got some great tools and great information. Maybe not tools, but great information processes. A lot of the stuff, that's the other thing, is a lot of these things for security are really people and process. There's people, process, and technology, right? We're always looking for a technological fix. But a lot of these are people and process things that need to be fixed. You need to add people, you need to add process, change people a little bit. And so that's a really important distinction in resilience as well. And that you can't solve. There's a lot of these problems you can't solve without acknowledging that. And that's actually a realization that I made that was really the key to the next phase of my career. But that's a whole other talk. We should talk about that sometime. Let's talk about configuration mistakes instead. My career is not a configuration mistake. I enjoy my career very much. Thank you. And I enjoy talking with you folks. And did I mention thank you for inviting me? Configuration mistakes. I joked before, just don't make them, right? But they happen, And what I like is standardization. Basically, when I discover something is misconfigured, I like knowing that it's misconfigured everywhere. And you might think, Bob, that's crazy. But no, because then you can fix it everywhere with the same command. An automation tool like PowerCLI. PowerCLI is terrific. And it runs on Linux. I've been developing all the new security configuration guide stuff for vSphere 8 on a Linux box against vSphere and that. And it's been terrific. Very powerful. You can document stuff. What my old team 4 years ago and more, when I was doing the stuff out in the real world like you were doing it now, my old team, we actually had a cookbook, is what we called it. Just a set of recipes. They were all PowerCLI commands for automating things and setting things up and all that stuff. It's very powerful, very repeatable. And again, if you discover something's wrong, you can fix it, and you can issue the same command to different environments and things. And so Configuration mistakes beyond that, scanners, penetration tests, a lot of what you consider to be traditional security, that works really well for this stuff too. Configuration mistakes, they happen in all kinds of different ways, and yeah, catching them depends on the applications. Follow best practices, things like that. So, last on our list, software vulnerabilities, and software vulnerabilities are. I mentioned people in process. A lot of people in process stuff here. Software vulnerabilities are tough because most security is all just overhead. It's all work that isn't going to move your organization forward, and the patching is very much that way. At the best, patching gets you right back to where you started. It doesn't look like you did anything, and that's actually successful patching. And there's a lot of management that think that my guys my team just spent a ton of time patching, and it doesn't look like they did anything. Nothing changed. Well, you got rid of a vulnerability. Patching is really important because it's the only way to get rid of a vulnerability. It's the only way to get it out of your environment. But at the worst, it's perhaps a resume generating event. It's perhaps outages in that. I'm being a little dramatic here. I really hope that this isn't the case for people, but at the worst, things go wrong. And VMware, we've been trying to do better on this front. Some of the late vSphere 7 update 3 stuff was interesting, but we learned a lot from that, and actually that was really good because there's been a lot of good work since then for patching, revamping patching, or patch testing and things like that. And so really trying to make it easier to patch, more reliable. We also split, by the way, update releases. We're always going to have 3 update releases for vSphere. So there's going to be a GA of like vSphere 8, for example, GA, an update 1, an update 2, and an update 3. And sometimes those updates come out at the same time as a security vulnerability is announced. And we're really going to try, if you're running update 2 and an update 3 comes out, we're going to have a security patch for update 2 as well, so you don't have to take update 3 right away. Again, it's based on feedback, actually, looking at how customers use this stuff. And I just remember sometimes how I was a customer, and how tough it was sometimes. So, but if you've got feedback, that's a really good point. If you've got feedback, let us know. We don't use our products. Nobody in the software industry uses their products like you use the products. And so if something's bugging you, let us know. We can fix that stuff. So anyhow, I digress. I'm getting off track here a little bit, but I've got a little time. Patching is a process problem, honestly. I've got 2 ideas for patching. And first, it's a process problem. One of the biggest realizations that I made back in the day was, back in the day is probably 8 years ago now, the change managers don't understand. Your managers, your change managers, risk management, all that stuff, they don't understand vSphere. It's not their job to understand vSphere. All they see is you're trying to do something to critical systems in the middle of the day. And they go, no, absolutely not. Bob, you may not do that. End of story. But what I realized is that my change managers didn't understand vMotion, didn't understand that vCenter Server taking that down doesn't impact workloads. They didn't understand that vMotion can seamlessly move a VM around, and that's actually way better now with vSphere 7 as well. vSphere 7 and newer, vSphere 7 rewrote vMotion. And so if your organization is scared of vMotion or doesn't like doing it for some workloads, try it again because it's a lot better. But my point here is spend time educating. Spend time talking with your management and with your change managers about what this stuff is and what it does, and that you're not crazy, that you do want to patch in the middle of the day because you're not tired and it's not the middle of the night and there's not going to be human errors. Human errors, by the way, there was a study a number of years ago that said something like 80% of IT outages are due to human error. I always use that to justify my going on vacation, going on holiday. Well, if 80% of the errors are the problems we have are created by humans, if I remove the humans from the equation, we should have 80% less outages, right? So my management, we don't know about that, Bob. But at any rate, talk to your folks about it. They don't know this stuff. Don't expect them to know this stuff, but clue them in, and you'll be surprised. I started getting a lot more yeses. The other thing too is it's a design problem. Patching, we just don't design in failover. So you can build in failover, or if you don't want to spend the money for the failover, because failover often costs money and extra parts and maintenance and extra systems and things like that, capacity and whatnot. Just set expectations. The system is going to be down from time to time to patch, and that's just the way it is. You can either pick a scheduled time to have it patch, or an attacker will pick a time that's convenient to them, and then you're going to have a long outage. What would you like to choose there, dear management? And most systems can be down a little bit. But there's some technological things. I talked about people and process. There's some technology things that can help with patching, making patching resilient. Multi-chassis LACP, the idea that your network switches need to be patched too, right? Or might have outages. VRRP, Virtual Router Redundancy Protocol, multi-chassis link aggregation groups, multi-chassis LACP, has nearly instantaneous failover between links that are going down. And not everything supports it, but where you can, I've actually become a big fan of it, honestly. And because it's just very quick failover, and there's no timeouts, there's no glitches. Second, keep alive D, cluster services. And actually, I'm going to skip to the end of my slide here. Dependency host. I used to invent a dependency host, a separate server that I would run because if everything is off, what do you do when everything's off, right? If everything's off, I need a DNS resolver, I need Active Directory, I need a KMS system, and probably an NTP source. I ran those on a single ESXi host that I could start up and have those automatically come up. But I had those individual things. I had that KMS system clustered with another copy of the KMS system. It was clustered with another instance in the main cluster, in the main vSphere cluster that was at that location. So I could turn on the dependency host, bring those workloads up, and then I use Keep Alive D, for example, on Linux to have a failover IP, a service IP or a virtual IP that would float back and forth. That way I could patch the dependency host as well and not have an outage with the main cluster. Something to think about, but it's, most of this talk here is just planting ideas with you. Don't break vMotion, though. That's the biggest thing for for resilience, especially just for small stuff, for patching, all that stuff. Anytime you've got vMotion where you're not using vMotion, or a VM can't vMotion because it's tied to a piece of hardware or whatever, that's friction. It's making your life a little bit more rough, and so try not to do that. Then the last thing here, have services automatically start, and this is a real pain, getting workload admins to do this stuff. But we did it as part of work to do monthly patching for all of our workloads and all that stuff. And that once we got that done, it was great because we'd patch and the services the workloads would just come right back up again. Or we have a vSphere HA event. Sometimes, you have a hardware failure for whatever reason. Those VMs restart somewhere else. And if it happened in the middle of the night, sometimes people wouldn't even notice. We would only just get little alarms from our monitoring systems, and then somebody'd have to log in because everything was back to see what was going on, because everything was back up. But anyhow, as far as LACP goes, even low-end switches like this one have LACP, multi-chassis LACP. So check it out. My last thought, really, again, if it can't be patched during business hours, it's not going to respond to a real failure. Actually, my last thought is check your backups. Make sure your backups aren't connected to Active Directory and are protected as well. If you do anything here, please sign up for Security Advisory mailing list. It's probably the most negative mailing list you'll ever be part of. It's only bad news, but I'm joking. Well, it's true. But you want to hear about this stuff at the same time everyone else is hearing about it. So sign up for that. If you need hardening guidance, the security, the vSphere Cloud Infrastructure stuff, hardening guides, all that at this URL. The QR code just takes you to that redirector, which takes you to core.vmware.com. We've got ransomware guidance. I've got a whole paper on ransomware resilience, worth a lot of these same ideas, just a lot more words there, but a lot of stuff on core.vmware.com/security. And so, yeah, that's it. Thank you very much. I really appreciate you. Thanks for being our customers. Thanks for supporting VMUG. And glad to talk to you. Love to come back sometime. Just let me know. Take care.